The man known to history as Muammar Gaddafi was born Muammar Muhammad Abu Minya al-Gaddafi, though many use the name Muammar Gaddafi. His date of birth is widely believed to be 1941, although certain scholars propose that he was born in the 1930s or 1943. He belonged to a Bedouin family of the Qardafa tribe, situated in the western deserts of Libya, close to the desert village of Qarsa Bu Hadi and south of the city of Sirte. The family traced its ancestry back to the Prophet Muhammad. Abu Menir, the common name of his father Muhammad Abdul Salam bin Hamad bin Muhammad, was a camel and goat herder who subsisted on the land. The name of his mother was Aisha bin Niran. Both individuals were descended from Arabs and resided in the impoverished rural communities that comprised the majority of Italian Libya. Gaddafi was born in a region that had been besieged by numerous invaders for millennia. Subsequently, he composed that members of his tribe were sea-afraid and refused to approach the ocean due to the legacy of seaborne invaders. Following the early 20th century decline of the Ottoman Empire, the most recent invasions transpired. Historically referred to as Tripoli, Libya had operated intermittently as a semi-autonomous region of the Turkish-led Ottoman Empire, at times behaving more like an independent state than a component of the empire. The divided Africa into domains of influence by European powers in 1902 posed a threat to this independence. Following deliberations, European leaders reached the consensus that Italy possessed a valid assertion to the landmass referred to as Libya. The Italians perceived Libya as their rightful domain, asserting possession on the grounds of their ancestry from the Romans, who had conquered the area more than a millennium prior. As Italian ambitions to subjugate Libya escalated, the region became entangled in discord due to the Young Turk Revolution, which shook the Ottoman Empire. Commencing in 1908, the Young Turk Revolution was a sequence of constitutional reforms imposed by Turkish nationalists. These reforms caused discord among the empire's elites, extending to distant provinces like Libya, where proponents of the revolutionaries aimed to remove the Sultan's political appointees. Amidst the anarchy that ensued after the revolution, a considerable number of Libyans lent their allegiance to the invading Italians as they launched a significant invasion of Libya in September 1911. Although the Italians quickly captured a number of coastal cities, they were unable to advance further into the Libyan hinterland, which precipitated a protracted and violent conflict between Ottoman Empire supporters and Italian forces and their allies. As the Ottoman Empire became increasingly entangled in World War I, the Libyans were compelled to rely more on their own resources, which contributed to the fragmentation of the Libyan resistance into smaller, more fractious factions. The Libyans and Italians engaged in protracted negotiations and combat until 1923, when the newly installed fascist leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini, ordered an all-out invasion of the territory. Libya was occupied by more than 20,000 Italian troops by 1926, and the dictator employed every conceivable tactic, including poison gas, tanks, and aircraft. Gaddafi's father, along with thousands of other Libyans, fought against these invaders. Nevertheless, their endeavors were predominantly in vain. The Italians not only supplied the Libyan people with cutting-edge weaponry, but they also established concentration camps that presumably housed more than 100,000 Libyans, or two-thirds of the population. Approximately 70,000 individuals may have perished in these facilities. To subdue resistance combatants, the Italians also engaged in all-out combat, destroying local wells and slaughtering livestock. In addition, a formidable barbed wire fence measuring 4 meters in height was erected between the cities of Bardia and Jakbub with the intention of impeding the influx of supplies originating from British-occupied Egypt. Officials encouraged large numbers of immigrants from the Italian mainland to migrate to the newly conquered territory as the Italians seized control of larger portions of Libya, especially as Mussolini's policies of massive public works began to reach Libya. Roads, new settlements, and other contemporary conveniences were implemented by the Italian government in Libya as part of its initiative to expand European influence. Nevertheless, they actively dissuaded local political engagement, preferring an Italian-led administration that engaged in frequent confrontations with indigenous Libyan communities. In an effort to conform the Libyan people to their colonizers' ideals, the Italians additionally endeavored to stifle all Libyan literature. During this time period, a significant number of Libyans maintained their support for pan-Islamic administrations, which sought to unite diverse nationalities under the Islamic faith. Conversely, an increasing segment of the Libyan populace, especially the younger cohort that reached adulthood subsequent to the Italian occupation and the Ottoman Empire's fall in 1918, developed an affinity for Arab nationalism, which posits the existence of a state predicated on Arab ethnicity as opposed to religion. The initial endeavors to establish an autonomous nation-state of Libya occurred in November 1918 with the establishment of the Tripoli Republic, which proclaimed its autonomy from European and Ottoman powers. European powers, however, did not acknowledge the situation, especially considering that the British had pledged the Italians control of Libya in 1915 in exchange for their support during the First World War. Occupation by the Italians and suppression of local political activity were the outcomes. Many Libyan exiles fled persecution in the 1920s and 1930s and engaged the Italians in a heated, albeit ineffective, verbal war, which contributed to the formation of a powerful Libyan nationalist movement that would later influence Gaddafi. Few Libyans were inclined to support the Allies or the Axis during World War II. Former foes comprised members of both factions. The Allies retained the British and French, who had granted Italy permission to conquer Libya. The Axis retained Italy. The Libyan people extended some aid to the Allies in return for assurances of independence after the conclusion of the war. Despite this, a significant portion of the Libyan populace had never placed much faith in European assurances. The British and French partitioned Libya into spheres of control in the aftermath of the conflict. It is possible that Gaddafi encountered personnel from these two Allied powers during his childhood. British, French, Italian, and American negotiators continued to discuss the destiny of the Italian colony for the next decade. Despite the fact that Italian and British officials initially supported a return of the colony to a divided colonial status, opposition from the other parties rendered these plans futile. While Libyan politics continued to be polarized by region, with some advocating for the country to be divided into three distinct nations, the United Nations General Assembly acknowledged the increasing demand for independence on November 21, 1949. Following an extensive and substantive discussion, the delegates voted to establish Libya as an independent and sovereign state by January 1, 1952. Rapid advancements were made towards independence after a commission consisting of Libyan and international delegates was appointed. On October 7, 1951, the Libyan National Assembly granted approval for the establishment of a constitutional, hereditary monarchy operating within the framework of a federal system. Muhammad Idris al-Maladi al-Sanusi, formerly referred to as King Idris I, was crowned the inaugural monarch of Libya, and Islam was proclaimed the official state religion. Libya maintained a steadfast allegiance to Western powers amidst the escalating Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout this time period. Despite facing severe poverty and disunity in the beginning, the Libyan state appeared to be progressing towards greater prosperity as agreements with Italy and the oil discovery in 1959 granted King Idris enhanced economic stability. Nevertheless, instead of embracing the liberalization that accompanied the growth of the economy, King Idris consolidated his authority over the state, resisting endeavors to institute political and social reform. Several Libyans were incensed that a significant portion of the oil industry's excess profits went to Westerners, notwithstanding the fact that Western firms had provided the majority of the capital used to develop the oil industry. Additionally, oil revenues exacerbated wealth disparities among Libyans, which infuriated a great number of young Libyans who regarded their government as antiquated and beholden to Western powers. These tensions between the people and the king's government grew steadily higher throughout the 1960s, prompting many to look for an alternative solution to the corruption among the king's officials. The proliferation of pan-Arab nationalism, an ideology predicated on the notion that Arabs might reclaim their former splendor by uniting against external aggressors throughout the region, exacerbated these issues. This system of belief gained significant traction, notably among the youth of Arab descent residing in North Africa and the Middle East, in particular after the Israeli forces humiliated Arab armies during the Six-Day War, which transpired from June 5 to June 10, 1967. Numerous Arabs were indignant at the Western reaction to Israel's triumph. Each of these elements contributed to the formation of the ideal tempest that was essential for a revolution. Gazing over the herds of his family, Gaddafi observed his cherished people appear to be yielding to corruption and Western influence. According to legend, Gaddafi attended a local Muslim elementary school, where he was subjected to contempt due to his Bedouin heritage. On weekdays, he allegedly spent the night in the local mosque. On weekends, he would visit his family, which consisted primarily of his mother and 3 sisters. His father, who was now a merchant, was frequently away from home and traveling. Gaddafi was extraordinarily ardent in his nationalistic and Muslim Arab lineage pride. It is probable that his father and others recounted the atrocities committed by the Italians and other Westerners during the World War era, which infuriated him. Possibly in sorrow, he witnessed the establishment of Israel in 1948, which signified the end of Palestine as an Arab state. In spite of the numerous setbacks endured by the Arabs, one luminary emerged within the Arab world, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had orchestrated a coup d'état to depose Egyptian King Farouk in 1952, around the time Gaddafi was 10 years old. Gaddafi developed a strong predilection for the Cairo, Egypt-based radio program, The Voice of the Arabs, which was critical of the Nasser regime. During his adolescence, Gaddafi discovered Nasser to be his idol. The young Libyan disciple found Nasser's endeavors to eradicate Western influence from Egypt, socialize the country, and unite Arabs throughout the Middle East and North Africa to be immensely inspiring. As a lowly adolescent in the rural west of Libya, Gaddafi claims that it was during this period that he first began to envision himself as a hero like Nasser and as a means of transforming his nation. Gaddafi orchestrated student demonstrations at the local level throughout the 1956 Suez Crisis, which began in late 1956 and was colloquially referred to in many Arab households as the tripartite aggression or the Second Arab-Israeli War. This conflict arose from the invasion of Egypt by Israel, the United Kingdom, and France with the objective of seizing the Suez Canal and toppling Nasser, who had recently privatized the canal from foreign ownership. Primarily, Israel aimed to terminate Nasser's obstruction of their port located in the Straits of Tiran. The European invasion proved to be unsuccessful, which in turn bolstered the reputation and prestige of Nasser among numerous young Arabs, including Gaddafi, who was 15 years old at the time. Many Libyans were infuriated, and violent demonstrations ensued throughout the nation, in response to the news that British officials had contemplated utilizing their bases in Libya to launch an assault on Egypt. It can be inferred that Gaddafi expressed approval of the rioting and protests, perceiving them as an attempt to free the country from the influence of Western powers. Gaddafi was regarded by his contemporaries as a leader and was notorious for his commanding persona. Similar to himself, numerous colleagues aspired to liberate Libya through the eventual overthrow of King Idris. Gaddafi attended Saba High School in Fezzan, Gaddafi, during his adolescence. In that location, he and his companions established a central committee and conducted clandestine gatherings to deliberate on the political philosophies of President Nasser and possibly other prominent Arab intellectuals, while simultaneously devising a scheme to topple the monarchy of Libya. He divided his adherents into cells of revolutionary operatives as his movement grew in size. Although Gaddafi's leadership of Libyan Arab nationalists was far from that of a genuinely revolutionary movement, he did exhibit some promise. Gaddafi grew increasingly averse to teachers and intellectuals as he worked to found his movement. He considered these individuals to have an enormous self-regard, and believed that they frequently misled their pupils. Later in life, Gaddafi frequently targeted educators with criticism in his speeches, potentially as a reflection of his own adolescent experiences. Gaddafi was expelled from his educational institution in 1961 for directing a student demonstration that opposed Syria's withdrawal from the United Arab Republic, an alliance it had formed with Egypt in 1958. Sassa was lauded by Gaddafi during the demonstration in the heart of Sebha, while British and American military bases in Libya were condemned. Not only was he expelled for his speech, but he was also prohibited from attending school in his native province. Gaddafi left his family and residence and traveled more than 700 kilometers north to Misrata, where he completed his studies in 1961. Gaddafi, undeterred by his expulsion from his native province, continued his education while expanding his revolutionary network. Gaddafi successfully enlisted individuals in Tripoli, Janzur, Soliton, and Homs, in addition to Misrata, thereby establishing an even more extensive network of revolutionary cells across the nation. As he constructed his network, Gaddafi attended the University of Tripoli for a brief history course. Nevertheless, a more significant assembly of his adherents occurred in 1963. A gathering of cells from Saba, Misrata, Tripoli, and presumably additional cities convened to deliberate on forthcoming strategies for the movement. Participants and organizers at this meeting reached a consensus that Gaddafi, along with 2 other movement members, would enroll at the Benghazi Military Academy. However, there are those who argue that Gaddafi alone conceived of this notion. Their intention upon enlisting in the military was to initiate the recruitment process for rebellion supporters. As Gaddafi later reflected, only the army could forcibly impose the will of the people. Gaddafi quickly insisted that his followers enlist in the military, and while some of his fellow revolutionaries were hesitant to do so, his directives had to be strictly adhered to. Upon joining the army, Gaddafi restructured his movement in a manner that closely resembled that of Nasser's Egyptian revolutionaries. In doing so, he established an additional central committee to oversee the movement and renamed it the Free Unionist Officers Movement. A number of Gaddafi's childhood companions became crucial members of his inner circle during his ascent to power. Ali al-Hudari, Abdul Salam Jalaud, Mustafa al-Karoubi, and Abu Bakr Yunus Jabir were among these individuals. They all ascended to esteemed positions in Gaddafi's regime. As a result of his rebellion against officers and the military structure, Gaddafi was frequently punished. Despite this, the young man persisted in challenging the system that he abhorred. Revolutionary gatherings were conducted clandestinely and during holidays across various locations in Libya. Recruits for the movement persisted with great zeal, as they endeavored to amass the widespread backing, especially within the military, that was critical for carrying out a successful revolution. They also amassed and concealed military supplies across the entirety of Libya. During his time at the academy, Gaddafi exhibited a malevolent and ominous facet of his leadership. When a cadet engaged in sexual activity under Gaddafi's command, the young cadet was bound at the hands and feet and dragged to a firing location, where Gaddafi and his associates fired upon the young man without fatality. An officer was then dispatched to complete the killing, at which point Gaddafi and his fellow officers laughed. In 1965, Gaddafi himself earned a degree from the academy. Throughout his training, Gaddafi made brief educational trips to Turkey and the United Kingdom, where he acquired knowledge of sophisticated communications techniques. Gaddafi derided the British and all that the West represented during his time in England, perceiving it as an embodiment of corruption and conquest. Recruits and stolen government supplies and ammunition flooded into Gaddafi's movement on a consistent basis from 1965 to 1969. Early in 1969, Gaddafi had ceased daydreaming about revolution and was prepared to implement it. He and his close associates held the conviction that they possessed sufficient backing across the entire Libyan military apparatus to execute the rebellion of their dreams. Several scheduled revolt dates were postponed due to unforeseen circumstances that materialized at each subsequent occasion. Suspicious military leadership had also become aware of rumors regarding a possible conspiracy, and Gaddafi was subjected to extensive interrogation and surveillance. During clandestine gatherings, Gaddafi and his fellow leaders were frequently on the verge of apprehension. The lack of strict control and the movement's youth may have contributed to its survival against a swift suppression by military authorities. Later, high-ranking military officials reminisce that they were reasonably certain Gaddafi and his followers were plotting a coup, but they deemed it an impossible pipe fantasy to materialize. On September 1, 1969, Gaddafi and his adherents initiated a revolution, demonstrating how erroneous those officials had been. Gaddafi was anxious at the onset of the rebellion, but he maintained composure by relying on his faith in Allah, whom he perceived to be on his side. Gaddafi recalled that a radio broadcast emanating from Egypt had featured the Quranic verse, "Allah will not deny the faithful their reward." Interpreting this verse as a portent, Gaddafi maintained his conviction that he and his accomplices would triumphantly institute an authentic Arab government at 2:30 a.m., the premeditated hour of the coup, which would steadfastly reject Western imperialism. During the pre-signaled hour, Gaddafi and his adherents exerted control over government-critical communication networks, including radio stations. Conspirators not reaching their intended location, officials evading apprehension, and an innumerable array of other complications marred the coup. Nevertheless, the Libyan government, rendered polarized and without influence, crumbled beneath the determined conspirators. King Idris, while absent from the palace, sought assistance from the British. Nevertheless, British officials harbored an aversion towards any form of intervention in the Middle East. Rapidly, the monarchy had fell, and Gaddafi and his adherents now possessed absolute power in the state. Libyans were awakened on September 1, 1969, by the radio broadcasts featuring the voice of Gaddafi. He delivered a speech filled with enthusiasm, asserting that Libya is a sovereign, self-governing republic. She shall progress along the path to freedom, unity, and social justice. And with the assistance of God, prosperity and equality shall be perceived as guiding principles for all. In the weeks that followed, Gaddafi and his circle endeavored to portray themselves to the populace as exemplary leaders. Gaddafi garnered his support from a cohort of enlightened Libyans belonging to the middle class who readily embraced the principles of pan-Arab nationalism. Numerous students had been instructed by nationalistic instructors from Sudan, Egypt, and Palestine who had been appointed to staff schools in Libya before the revolution. A number of individuals had followed in the footsteps of Gaddafi, who as an adolescent listened to radio broadcasts from Middle Eastern organizations advocating for a transition to Arab unity. Moreover, additional Libyans had studied at universities in Iraq and Egypt, where the nations had been revolutionized by the achievements of nationalist leaders. A great number of Libyans were enthralled by the youthfulness, modest beginnings, and allure of the new revolutionary leaders. While certain Libyans were enthused by the revolutionary cadre's apparent sudden emergence and apparent lack of experience in international politics, others were concerned that it had emerged from nowhere. Gaddafi and his revolutionary army recognized the critical nature of their situation and the urgency of taking action to ensure the survival of their movement. In an effort to secure their triumph, Gaddafi initiated communication with Egypt. In a similar manner to numerous other world leaders, President Nasser dispatched his principal advisor to investigate the situation in Libya out of shock. Nasser later encountered Gaddafi and was astounded by the primitive nature of the revolutionaries. Undoubtedly, the revolution had come as a surprise to even the most ardent pan-Arabist. Notwithstanding his astonishment, Nasser dispatched a multitude of military officers and advisors in an effort to avert a counter-revolution. With the advent of Egyptian advisors, Gaddafi and his inner circle expeditiously undertook measures to fundamentally reshape the nation's political framework and eradicate the final remnants of royal authority. Hundreds of individuals, including members of the royal family, politicians, government officials, and army officers who posed the least threat, were arrested by him and his companions. During that period, these adversaries faced light punishments. However, Gaddafi and his revolutionaries subjected them to public tribunals that were broadcast nationally via television, which served to humiliate them. In addition, Gaddafi assisted in removing the political influence of Libyan tribal leaders by redrawing administrative borders to deliberately sever traditional tribal boundaries and by appointing his supporters to city positions of authority. Opposition thinkers' haven al-Baida Islamic University was shut down, and the army was bolstered. As he repressed the opposition, Gaddafi made strategic maneuvers to bolster his own position. Concurrent with the formation of a civilian government, Gaddafi assumed command of the army by attaining the same rank of colonel that Nasser had previously held. His accomplices, who had been assured that power would be returned to the people following the rebellion, started to discern that Gaddafi had no intention of relinquishing his authority. In December 1969, several recently appointed civilian leaders endeavored to execute an additional coup with the intention of toppling Gaddafi. Nevertheless, they encountered abysmal failure. Gaddafi's actions infuriated even a few of his closest associates, most notably Mohammad Najm, an ardent supporter of democracy. Additional revolutionaries were alarmed by Gaddafi's public criticisms of his accomplices and his endeavors to attribute the revolution's setbacks to his allies. In general, however, Gaddafi's followers continued to be astounded by their leader's brilliance in overcoming insurmountable obstacles to depose the monarch and his Western-backed supporters. While a portion of the Libyan population was appalled by Gaddafi's regime, a great number were ecstatic about the assaults on Western institutions within the country. The closure of foreign military bases resulted in the expulsion of the British in March 1970, with the Americans being expelled a few months later. The final members of the Jewish community in Libya were expelled in the same manner as the Italian immigrants. The expelled individuals' property and assets were confiscated by the Gaddafi regime, which justified the seizures on the grounds of anti-imperialism. Foreign banking capital and oil facilities were confiscated in Libya, with the oil facilities subsequently nationalized for the benefit of the Libyan state. Consistently a devout individual, Gaddafi openly confronted the impact of Western cultural influence by storming and shuttering casinos and nightclubs and prohibiting alcohol in observance of specific Islamic tenets. Sharia law, which adheres to Islamic religious principles, replaced the secular system instituted by the monarch in 1972. Libyan oil revenues were also utilized to finance the Islamic Call Society, a Muslim missionary organization that Gaddafi founded and which disseminated propaganda in support of Libya and Islam. A considerable number of Libyans were ecstatic about the restoration of religious authority and the expulsion of Western powers from the country, while others were incensed at the violation of their rights. Excessive years of imperial ambitions had hardened the sentiments of the majority of Libyans towards the West. As conquerors and colonizers, the West frequently breached its commitments and fostered corruption in local governments. Utilizing these sentiments to his advantage, Gaddafi amassed his own power and galvanized widespread support for his schemes. With the most dramatic law being Law No. 71, Gaddafi and his closest allies mobilized the state to prohibit any political activity that did not receive approval from his inner circle. A legislation enacted in 1972 mandated the capital punishment for any Libyan involved in party politics. This provision persisted until Gaddafi's downfall in 2011. Additionally, the revolutionaries outlawed unofficial trade unions, with the government's Ministry of Labor closely monitoring only authorized unions. The autonomy of the press was severely restricted when the state ordered the closure of 10 prominent newspapers. Censorship was strictly enforced on even state-approved presses to guarantee that solely the state's messages could be distributed. Nevertheless, amidst these transformations, substantial formal strategizing regarding the nation's reconstruction or economic stimulation was lacking. As authoritarian measures were implemented, unemployment skyrocketed and the economy collapsed. As chaos appeared to be swiftly approaching Libya, an increasing number of Libyans developed skepticism towards the youthful revolutionaries. Discourse concerning the aspirations of Arab nationalism lacked the weight of actualization. Even a formerly popular government started to lose favor when it appeared that progress had halted. As the nation was imperiled by these crises, Gaddafi initiated measures to consolidate his authority over his fellow revolutionaries. An increasing number of his erstwhile allies were provoked by Gaddafi's tyrannical demeanor and lordly demeanor. An increasing number of his allies began to express discontent with Gaddafi and his recurrent, immature outbursts during meetings in response to opposition. Loyal individuals were integrated into a nascent political movement, which Gaddafi progressively coordinated with the intention of marginalizing the Free Unionist officers. A considerable proportion of the New Order's members were relatives and members of other organizations that had not joined the revolution at the outset. Although Gaddafi had achieved political power, he was disheartened that the social fabric revolution that he desired to transpire was not taking place. Although many Libyans admired Gaddafi's anti-Western and pro-Muslim discourse, they were unwilling to make significant lifestyle adjustments in order to support his vision of revolutionary social transformation. This prompted Gaddafi to issue a resignation threat in 1972, following which he embarked on a brief sojourn in Egypt. Upon his repatriation, Gaddafi was apprised by his fellow revolutionary leaders that his resignation had been accepted. Infuriated, Gaddafi apprised the Central Committee that none of them had been elected, to which they replied that Gaddafi had not been elected either. Gaddafi, enraged, replied, "I possess the backing of the people and will tender my resignation directly to them." The committee, possibly recognizing an opportunity to remove their leader, agreed to Gaddafi's plan and arranged a special gathering in the vicinity of Tripoli on April 16, 1973, to provide an opportunity for the people to behold Gaddafi's public resignation. The scheduled location for the meeting was the tranquil municipality of Zawara. At the designated time, Gaddafi assumed his position on the platform, and with each rising word he astonished his audience. Instead of tendering his resignation, Gaddafi openly advocated for a transformation in order to spare the revolution and remedy the Libyan people's sloth. It was time, according to Gaddafi, for a cultural revolution. According to one historian, when Gaddafi initiated his new revolution, intense personalization of politics commenced, which pervaded Libyan society until 2011. Gaddafi declared in his program that it would comprise 5 significant elements. Initially, the intention was to substitute every pre-existing legislation with revolutionary decrees. The state was also tasked with eradicating any anti-revolutionary components of society. Thirdly, support would be extended for a revolution that would eradicate the existing administrative state and every facet of bourgeois society. Fourth, a substantial militia comprised of armed citizens would be assembled to safeguard the revolution. And lastly, any concepts that were in opposition to the teachings of the Quran would be eradicated. It was prescribed that committees govern all facets of society and be elected by the populace in each municipality. Leaders who had managed to survive the preceding purges, including mayors, school administrators, and local leaders, were removed from their positions. Gaddafi issued a call to his university supporters to destroy all imported books that failed to represent Arabism, Islam, socialism, and progress. By August 1973, in particular, scores of regime opponents and those accused of sedition by personal rivals on these committees had been arrested and over 2,000 committees had been established, with numerous regime opponents arrested. Instead of reducing the scale of the bureaucracy, it had nearly doubled, granting the government authority over virtually every facet of social existence. Amidst the rapid expansion of the state apparatus, Gaddafi's proposed militia amassed more than 40,000 new members in its first year of operation, providing him with a formidable and devoted force of supporters. Gaddafi was prepared to coerce the general populace into joining him in the revolution, irrespective of their personal preferences. As a result of Gaddafi's exposition of this social revolution, it became referred to as the Third Universal Theory. At an international conference of Arab and European youth, Gaddafi first presented this theory, asserting that it would benefit all of humanity and be founded on the truth. According to Gaddafi, His theories aimed to traverse the political continuum from communism to capitalism and represented a novel compromise. Gaddafi contended that capitalism had transformed societies into a circus that had been surrendered to the individual without any constraints, whereas communism had reduced human beings to mere subjects subject to governmental control, akin to livestock. Gaddafi posited that his theories would be most effective in countries classified as the Third World, thereby enhancing the prospects of resistance against more powerful and oppressive nations. Gaddafi's convictions were firmly rooted in his Islamic faith, and the Third Universal Theory operated under the presumption that humanity must return to the kingdom of God to achieve success. Nevertheless, Gaddafi's theory was predominantly socialist, with a significant Islamic component incorporated. He was certain that his novel invention represented the sole means for the Third World to resist imperialism, the allure of capitalism and communism, and imperialism. Although met with acclaim from his adherents, the theory encountered substantial censure due to its perceived absence of novelty and its perplexing structure. Subsequently, Gaddafi expounded upon his concepts in the Green Book, a three-part series initially published in 1975. This publication detailed Gaddafi's blueprint for establishing an improved global order, encompassing political, economic, and social matters. The book argued that a stateless society is necessary for a genuine democracy to exist. Gaddafi held the view that political parties and parliaments hindered the advancement of the people and fostered discord. Conversely, Gaddafi advocated for a form of governance comprised of small committees in which each citizen had a say, a goal he believed Libya was successfully attaining. Further, he advocated for the complete abolition of remuneration and the explicit prohibition of anything that could potentially exploit another human being. Gaddafi also expressed his societal views in the Green Book, advocating for the family as the fundamental pillar of a utopian society. In addition to opposing gender-based discrimination, he maintained that there were distinct roles for men and women, with women being predominantly accountable for the upbringing of children. Although the Green Book was subject to criticism, it served as a viable strategy for Gaddafi and his supporters to comprehend the complex revolution that they were attempting to implement in Libya. Gaddafi perceived his political theories as analogous to a postmodern gospel embraced by the general populace. Others celebrated this young man at the helm of a revolution that vowed to liberate an Islamic state from the sway of Western powers, whereas some regarded his views as perplexing. Throughout his speaking travels in various Arab states, Gaddafi effectively disseminated the revolutionary message to an expansive audience. Some individuals hypothesized that Gaddafi, buoyant on his own success, had become arrogant, believing himself to be the leader not only of Libya but also the Islamic world. A portion of his revolutionary compatriots became increasingly enraged by Gaddafi's hubris. A minority of individuals withdrew their support for the new government and tendered their resignations. Certain former acquaintances resorted to more drastic actions, including the 1975 coup attempt, which, similar to the preceding coup attempt, was a resounding failure because it was discovered prior to its commencement. Gaddafi maintained a firm grip on power and harbored zero tolerance for any form of rebellion. Announcing the declaration of the establishment of the authority of the people on March 2, 1977 in Sebha, Libya, Gaddafi initiated the Jamahiriya, also known as the State of the Masses. In principle, this proclamation established the state that Gaddafi had envisioned in his Green Book. Gaddafi renamed Libya the Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, and altered the flag to a plain green one in conjunction with the momentous occasion. Fidel Castro, the autocrat of Cuba, was extended an invitation to attend the ceremonies as the special guest of honor. Castro lauded the Libyan people, and the streets were filled with revelers commemorating the beginning of a new era in Libya. Notwithstanding his rhetoric advocating for popular sovereignty, Gaddafi persisted in his position as the sovereign of the state. Immediately upon the thousands of local committees commenced operations, complications emerged. Destruction ensued due to the absence of participation from the majority of Libyans and the ambiguity surrounding the responsibilities of local administrations. Moreover, in addition, the government seized every private parcel of land and leased to individuals only that which was essential for subsistence. There was widespread corruption, and little confidence was placed in the newly implemented system. Furthermore, opposition to Gaddafi's regime was intensifying. Similar to how they had protested Gaddafi years prior, students took to the streets this time to voice their discontent with the man who was ostensibly the savior of Libya. Students were extensively detained and arrested in Tripoli and Benghazi for minor protests a year prior to Gaddafi's attempt to convert the state into his ideal society. After the Libyan state transition in March 1977, Gaddafi escalated his hostility towards the students by publicly executing several individuals who had participated in the protests the previous year. The hangings occurred on the Al-Fatah University campus in Tripoli, where students were compelled to observe the deaths of their peers. The exhibition of power, however, extended beyond the confines of Tripoli. The aforementioned occurrences, in addition to numerous other public executions of individuals suspected of espionage or involvement in the 1975 coup attempt, were broadcast nationwide. Public executions would continue to occur on April 7 for the duration of Gaddafi's rule. Nevertheless, despite Gaddafi's openness to employing ruthless force to quell dissenters, he also devised strategies to consolidate his authority and safeguard his revolution. Gaddafi made a public declaration in September 1978 that a future power structure would be established to distinguish between revolutionary authority and the people's authority. Following this, Gaddafi and the remaining members of the original Central Committee tendered their resignations from governmental roles in March 1979, with the intention of upholding the revolutionary ideals that were established in 1969. Gaddafi maintained his position as armed forces commander and adopted the moniker leader of the revolution, or brother leader. Notwithstanding his formal relinquishment of his state authority, Gaddafi and his close associates maintained absolute power in Libya. Fundamentally, Gaddafi had transferred genuine state authority in Libya from popular sovereignty to the exclusive confines of his inner circle. In order to bolster his regime's support, Gaddafi initiated the formation of the Revolutionary Committees movement, a paramilitary organization that had been in part created since 1976 prior to its official organization in 1979. Originating on university campuses, these organizations were established by revolution-zealous students who were tasked with identifying and expelling dissidents from Libya's numerous universities, students or staff alike. In 1978, Gaddafi issued a proclamation stating that his revolutionaries would be present everywhere, whether in secret or open, to fulfill the responsibility of inciting the masses to revolt so as to seize power and to dismantle any oppositional organization. In essence, Gaddafi had established his own secret police, which, fueled by allegiance to his revolution, would eliminate any regime critics prior to they emerged as a threat. Shortly thereafter, Gaddafi granted complete authority to these committees in the process of electing the leadership of local people's committees and congresses. He dubbed these newcomers the prophets of the age of the masses. To ensure his and the regime's protection by meticulously overseeing these revolutionaries, Gaddafi established the Revolutionary Committee's Liaison Office, a supervisory body comprised of family members and tribesmen with vested interests in Gaddafi's survival. Gaddafi astutely designated Mohammad Majdoub, a devoted supporter and relative of his, as the chief of this office, while prohibiting communication among the revolutionary cells. The requirement that all operations emanate from the central office effectively averted an internal uprising for Gaddafi. The ex-revolutionary had no desire to confront a revolt that sought to overthrow him. Infiltration of revolutionary committees into various spheres of Libyan society ensued, including media centers, classrooms, and committee chambers. Ordinary Libyans were exposed to a state-controlled stream of propaganda due to the decline of the free press. Gaddafi ensured that no reporter or news broadcaster amassed an excessive amount of notoriety prior to their ousting. Fundamentally, Gaddafi and his newly formed revolutionary faction had restructured society in such a way that alienated Libyans from both the external environment and the realities of their nation. By 1980, nearly all Libyans were isolated, as revolutionary committees led by Gaddafi were tasked with eliminating any and all opponents of the revolution. A surge of terror was unleashed by Gaddafi's adherents in an attempt to eradicate opposition. The Libyan populace was enveloped in a climate of dread as thousands were arrested. Beyond that point, not even the numerous imperial colonizers had managed to attain absolute dominion over Libyan society. A multitude of abhorrent anecdotes could be recounted regarding the terror and oppression that the Libyan people endured for the remainder of Gaddafi's reign. Public executions and televised interrogations solidified the notion that fighting meant suffering and death in the minds of many. It appeared that no one possessed the capability to contest the regime. While his operatives endeavored to suppress any opposition, Gaddafi's economic policies exacerbated the meager prosperity acquired prior to his ascent to authority. The depreciation of the Libyan dinar, the seizure of private property, and the sabotage of private commerce and trade wreaked devastation on the economy of Libya beyond description. As per Gaddafi's directives, the state began to intervene in every facet of the lives of Libyan citizens. Frequent consumer shortages afflicted the state-owned supermarkets, and the meager imports that did enter were frequently of substandard quality. Additionally, Gaddafi and his regime prohibited the practice of private medicine and law, compelling all practitioners to serve the state. As a result of Gaddafi's policies that stifled and constricted private sector employment, the majority of Libyans sought employment with the government. At the helm of all oil revenues, Gaddafi and his adherents were ecstatic to enlarge the state apparatus in order to create additional employment opportunities, the majority of which consisted of meaningless secretarial work. It was the government that furnished employment, healthcare, welfare, housing, and automobiles. However, the populace persisted in their impoverished condition, and public employee salaries were stagnant since 1981 until the late 2000s. As a consequence of Gaddafi's state-controlled economy, there was widespread destitution and an enormous waste of public funds. In addition to harming the urban areas, Gaddafi's policies also harmed the rural regions of the country by encouraging increased production, which led to depleted water reserves and overutilized land. In the 1980s and into the 21st century, the ideas and revolution of their leader caused suffering for the Libyan people. In the 1980s, as Gaddafi endeavored to revolutionize the economy, he employed the military as one of his instruments. Gaddafi, who had historically acquired substantial quantities of weaponry from the Soviet Union, endeavored to fortify his regime and the nation by instituting military education for the majority of Libyan citizens, commencing with the educational system. Military education mandated the study of military subjects and the mandatory wear of military uniforms. Essentially, students were conscripted into the armed forces. Gaddafi advanced with unwavering resolve and self-satisfaction, whether it involved acquiring nuclear weapons, converting vast swaths of arid into arable land, or extorting segments of the populace. He exercised authoritarian control over Libya by instituting and dismantling government offices, consolidating positions, and establishing new ones. Every individual was directly supervised by the brother leader, and every Libyan citizen recognized the critical reliance on Gaddafi for sustenance. Gaddafi's ambitions extended beyond mere dominion of Libya. He was a genuine radical who believed that his forces and revolution should exert their influence abroad. Although his state's alleged allegiance to the Soviet Union caused American leaders concern, the opposite could not be further from the truth. Gaddafi desired Russian firearms. However, he perceived Russia as an imperialistic force that merited opposition and eventual demise. Gaddafi desired for all to perceive him as an ally of those who were subjugated and opposed colonialism. Nevertheless, his aspiration was to serve as a revolutionary for the Arab world above all else. He held the conviction that his revolution possessed the means to subdue Israel, expel Westerners, and restore the Middle East to its former splendor. Rival leaders who were irritated with the young Libyan audaciousness ridiculed and resented his demeanor and intentions to conquer Israel. Gaddafi incited additional indignation among Arab leaders when, in June 1970, during a festivity in Libya, he issued a threat of revolution against foreign dignitaries that were visiting, including his idol, Egyptian President Nasser, if they failed to unite. Nasser slammed Gaddafi's forearm furiously on the table and demanded that he cease speaking. Despite a momentary reminder of his location, Gaddafi remained unaffected. He held the conviction that he would assume the position Nasser had inhabited in the realm of international politics following his passing in 1970. Furthermore, he asserted that Libya, and by extension himself, would serve as the impetus for the unification of all Arabs into a singular nation, in the same way that Piedmont and Prussia had united Germany and Italy, respectively. Ahead of the rest of the region, Gaddafi maintained an unwavering commitment to the notion of a pan-Arab nation. This determination persisted for the duration of his life. Constantly expressing this vision in his writings and speeches, Gaddafi envisioned his nation guiding Arabs towards a brighter future. As regional leaders opposed his endeavors to unite their nations with his own, Gaddafi initiated covert operations to eliminate his adversaries. Gaddafi was accused of assisting in the planning of an attempted assassination of Tunisian Prime Minister Hadi Nouaira in the 1970s and 1980s, as well as providing and training dissident Tunisians who stormed a mining town near the Tunisian-Libyan border. In response to French assistance to Tunisia, Gaddafi permitted rioters to torch the French embassy in Tripoli. He facilitated coup endeavors in Morocco and Sudan, in addition to attempting to incite uprisings in Egypt. In response to the endeavors of his Arab confederates to suppress the incendiary revolutionary, Gaddafi redoubled his own endeavors. In the 1980s, his support for the Iranian and Iraqi Kurdish resistance against Saddam Hussein, the nationalistic head of Iraq and a prominent Arab figure in the Middle East, infuriated his Arab compatriots. Ironically, Hussein was regarded as a criminal by Gaddafi, who exerted every effort in his capability to combat him. Gaddafi considered the Iranians to be considerably more anti-Western than the majority of Arabs, which he considered a primary quality. However, he did reach a consensus regarding the importance of providing support to the Palestinians. Fueled by his oil revenues, Gaddafi supported an extensive array of Palestinian organizations throughout the 1970s and 1980s, with a particular emphasis on the most extremist and militant factions. Assembling centers to instruct Arabs from throughout the Middle East in combat against the State of Israel, he also established the Jihad Fund to provide financial support for Palestinian military endeavors. Terror was a valid instrument in Gaddafi's arsenal for combating the State of Israel. Even with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Gaddafi's excessively radical stance caused a great number of Arabs to regard him as a ridiculous and irrational leader. While endeavoring to incite unrest in the Middle East, Gaddafi concurrently invested his crude revenues in political capital throughout Africa and the world. Gaddafi aspired to be perceived as a leader who sided with the weak in opposition to the powerful. Dozens of other movements in the Americas received his financial support, including communist insurgents in Italy and Japan, Muslim insurgents in the Philippines, the Irish Republican Army, and Basque separatists. However, a significant portion of his hydrocarbon revenues was invested in his African ventures. Gaddafi initially provided military assistance and Libyan dollars to President Idi Amin of Uganda, a dictator, during his 1972 conflict with Tanzania. Despite a decline in international opinion and the defeat of Amin's forces, he maintained his support for Amin. In 1978, Gaddafi dispatched 2,500 Libyan soldiers to his allies' aid, only to discover that they had been entirely defeated. Gaddafi also extended assistance to the Emperor of the Central African Republic, Jean Bedel Bokassa, particularly subsequent to his conversion to Islam in 1976. After channeling millions of dollars to Bokassa, Gaddafi discovered that the monarch had reverted to Christianity. Despite this, He maintained his support for the emperor and provided the cash-strapped dictator with assistance to maintain his ruthless regime in the Central African Republic. Similar to his inconsistent financial backing of despots, he also extended assistance to anti-colonial and anti-apartheid movements across Africa, such as the African National Congress led by Nelson Mandela. As Gaddafi emerged as a formidable figure in Africa, numerous leaders began to regard the Libyan dictator with due seriousness. Nevertheless, his most infamous intervention occurred in the African country of Chad, where he provided support to Muslim insurgents during their violent internecine conflict against the Christian regime. As the conflict against the Muslim insurgents progressed into the 1980s, Goukouni Wethi, their leader, was compelled to pursue peace negotiations. Aiming to apprehend Wethi while he was in Libya, Gaddafi insisted that the conflict continue. Devastating were the outcomes. Chad's populace unified in their opposition to Gaddafi and commenced a march in the direction of Libya. The conflict that raged from September 1987 until Chadian troops advanced into Libyan territory claimed the lives of 8,000 to 10,000 Libyan soldiers, the majority of whom were conscripts. The conflict not only culminated in a catastrophic loss, but also prompted a significant number of Libyan soldiers to defect to Chad and align themselves with the Libyan opposition. Although the conflict was extremely expensive, Gaddafi appeared indifferent to the consequences. Despite allocating financial resources to diverse initiatives throughout Africa and the Middle East, Gaddafi maintained an unwavering determination to depose all forms of imperialism, including those emanating from the Soviet Union and the West. By 1977, the leadership of the United States of America had become entirely estranged from Libya due to Gaddafi's perceived support for terrorism and insurgency. In 1982, Gaddafi established an international branch of his secret police known as the International Mataba to resist imperialism, racism, and reactionary forces, which exacerbated the deterioration of relations. This new force, under the leadership of Musa Kusa, one of the most formidable individuals in Libya, was charged with propagating Gaddafi's revolution internationally and punishing Libyans outside the country who ventured to oppose Gaddafi. Operating from Libyan embassies, Gaddafi's revolutionaries initiated efforts to apprehend Libyan dissidents, which they referred to as stray dogs. Gaddafi harbored a paranoid belief that the anti-regimists might succeed him in power, and in an effort to ruthlessly stifle them, he even sanctioned aircraft hijackings and foreign attacks. Nonetheless, prior to the formation of the International Mataba, Gaddafi's regime was actively striving to stifle dissenting voices. Mahmoud Abu Nafar, a lawyer, and Mohammed Ramadan, a Libyan journalist affiliated with the Arabic service of the BBC, were both Libyan expatriates who were fatally shot in London in April 1980. Following this, additional Libyans were murdered in Italy. Despite mounting international opposition, Gaddafi disregarded the international outrage. Once, he predicted, although some individuals would perish and be forgotten, in the end, righteousness, goodness, and progress would prevail. This outlook, coupled with Gaddafi's support for terrorism and connections to the Soviet Union, infuriated the United States. Gaddafi referred to President Ronald Reagan as a second-rate actor. Reagan, for his part, characterized Gaddafi as the mad dog of the Middle East, and perceived his interference in international affairs as a means to advance Soviet objectives. Prior to the establishment of the International Mataba by Gaddafi, Reagan severed diplomatic ties with Libya in 1981 and authorized U.S. aircraft to fire down 2 Libyan aircraft in the Gulf of Sirte over a dispute. Throughout the 1980s, tensions between the United States and Gaddafi were at an all-time high. Gaddafi, a resolute opponent of any challenge, but especially one originating from the West, persistently and openly provided assistance to revolutions worldwide. Over the years, Gaddafi had amassed a large number of adversaries, including the United States of America. During the 1970s and 1980s, Gaddafi's vehement rejection of all sources of knowledge other than the Quran infuriated Sunni Muslims. Moreover, Local and international Muslim leaders were frequently incensed by Gaddafi's religious beliefs. They denounced his actions and referred to him as a heretic. In opposition to Gaddafi's religious beliefs, local religious leaders were subjected to house detention, persecution, and even death, while their international counterparts continued to condemn him. The Libyan state's brutality and lack of freedom infuriated a great number of individuals. Gaddafi had estranged numerous leaders in the Middle East and Africa who perceived him as a menace beyond the borders of Libya. The reactions to Gaddafi in the West were varied. Certain individuals, notably the leaders of countries that relied heavily on the oil supply emanating from Libyan territory, advocated for disregarding the man. Leaders from the United States and the United Kingdom, among others, regarded Gaddafi as irresponsible and a threat to humanity. After several Americans were murdered in a nightclub bombing in Berlin, the Americans disclosed that Gaddafi was responsible for the attack. 10 days after the nightclub explosion, on April 15, 1986, 18 United States F-111 bombers attacked Libya, distributing approximately 60 tons of bombs across the country. Gaddafi possessed foreknowledge of an impending assault, thanks to the Italian Prime Minister informing the middle-aged revolutionary of the strategy devised by the United States. Despite the fact that the Gaddafi compound and military installations constituted the majority of the targets, stray explosives caused the deaths of several civilians in civilian areas. Gaddafi, who came perilously close to being killed, received a warning from the attack to proceed with caution. Gaddafi was humiliated and his military's feebleness was exposed by the assault, which belied the lavish financial investments he had made in it. Additionally, the assault provided an opportunity for Gaddafi's internal adversaries to attempt to depose the dictator. The populace offered little support for Gaddafi, and despite the suppression of attempted uprisings, Gaddafi was cognizant of the weaknesses in his authority. However, in the eyes of the international community, Gaddafi appeared to be intensifying his threats against the United States. In September 1986, Gaddafi issued a threat to mobilize armies worldwide with the intention of igniting a fire beneath the feet of the United States. In 1987, he issued a similar threat, stating that freedom fighters would be sacrificed in valor while opposing the United States. "The Yankees have no morals. They have no conscience," he renownedly declared. "They ought not to be regarded as human beings." Despite Gaddafi's indignation, numerous Arab leaders failed to exhibit resolute endorsement for the Libyan leader. Numerous individuals concurred with the United States' characterization of Libya as a pariah on the international scene and Gaddafi as a lunatic. Despite these sentiments, Gaddafi continued to be unchallenged. As the 1980s came to a close, Gaddafi's revolution progressively abandoned his people, resulting in an alarming loss of life. A combination of US sanctions and falling crude prices exacerbated an already precarious economic situation in the aftermath of the 1986 bombings. As it became more difficult to obtain food and medication, many individuals resorted to the already costly black market. The dire circumstances in Libya served as catalysts for heightened opposition to the regime and improved coordination among the diverse Libyan opposition factions that sought refuge beyond the country's borders. Despite being a revolutionary radical, Gaddafi did not act foolishly. In response to the escalating tensions within his country, Gaddafi initiated a series of superficial reforms in an effort to placate the populace. He initiated assaults against the revolutionary committees that, for more than 10 years, had predominantly operated under the pretext of coercion and intimidation to maintain Gaddafi's regime. Public demonstrations were organized by Gaddafi to commemorate the release of political prisoners and to criticize the revolutionaries. Other reforms implemented in his nation were similarly superficial, disregarding the more significant and urgent challenges that existed. Furthermore, he rescinded a number of his more assertive socialist measures, including the prohibition on private trade and those that had specifically targeted private businesses and corporations. Despite this, many Libyans remain cautious in light of their leader's radical shifts in position. Early 1990s economic reforms alleviated a number of Libya's most pressing issues, but a new tide of challenges rushed onto the country's shores. On November 27, 1991, the United States and the United Kingdom issued a joint appeal to Libya to hand over two of its nationals who were implicated in the bombing of a Pan-American World Airways flight over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, which resulted in the deaths of more than 260 individuals. Additionally, the two countries demanded that Libya acknowledge its responsibility for the atrocity and provide compensation. Gaddafi, as expected, was enraged. Subsequent sources suggest that the Libyans were merely a component of a more extensive terrorist scheme. However, Gaddafi delivered a succession of exceptionally provocative addresses in which he presented himself as the victim and exclusive defender of Arabs and oppressed peoples worldwide. Nonetheless, American and British sanctions threatened to terrify Gaddafi. Admitting full well the severe economic predicament in Libya, Gaddafi pleaded with the United Nations to intervene and made some conciliatory gestures. Gaddafi even disclosed his affiliation with terrorist organizations with the intention of gaining Western benevolence. These endeavors were insufficient and belated. The United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 748 on March 31, 1992, which instigated an array of sanctions against Libya. Nevertheless, despite the adverse effects of the 1993 sanctions and asset bans on the Libyan economy, European nations including Spain, Italy, and Germany assisted in safeguarding the country's primary source of wealth, oil. These states, which are the primary importers of Libyan oil, effectively and vigorously opposed the United States' proposal to impose sanctions on the Libyan oil industry through lobbying. Gaddafi could maintain control of the situation, at least for the time being. As the sanctions commenced to manifest, discontentment escalated in Libya. Due to the deprivation of fundamental necessities and the fear of the Gaddafi regime, a number of Libyan officers initiated preparations for a rebellion. Following their encounters with Libyan opposition factions in Germany, these officers initiated preparatory measures for a revolt reminiscent of the strategies employed by Gaddafi himself several decades prior. Conversely, in contrast to the monarchy, Gaddafi avoided all risk. The conspirators' apprehension occurred on October 11, 1993, effectively putting an immediate end to the scheme. The fact that many of the officers were members of a tribe regarded as close allies infuriated Gaddafi the most. Gaddafi was resolute in his intention to set an instance that would be long forgotten. As their interrogations were televised, Gaddafi compelled the aspiring revolutionaries to confess that they were American stooges. Gaddafi also ingeniously coerced his own tribe into punishing them and their families. Loyal factions of the Werfella tribe, including several individuals who had been involved in the conspirations, initiated the process of demolishing the residences of the revolutionaries and instilling fear among the relatives affiliated with the conspirators. The dreadful ordeal came to an end in January 1997 with the executions of 6 officers by firing squad and 2 civilians by hanging. An additional faction of dissidents surfaced, albeit not affiliated with the military, but rather militant Islamic organizations fervent in their objective to overthrow the Gaddafi regime, which they perceived as immoral. Gaddafi was taken aback by this, considering the revolutionary movement's prioritization of Islamic integration within the social fabric. With a suspicious gaze, he observed the neighboring country of Algeria descend into civil war during the 1990s, as Islamist factions opposed the army. Subterranean factions of Islamist activists initiated an independent revolution in Libya. Increasing numbers of activists denounced Gaddafi in public during the 1980s, and notwithstanding the brutal repression, an increasing segment of the Libyan populace developed sympathy. Gaddafi repressed the opposition through mass arrests throughout the 1990s, a response to a failed jihad by local militants in 1989. This inevitably resulted in torture and ruthless repression. In addition, Gaddafi initiated a verbal campaign of animosity towards the Islamist movement, labeling the militants and their supporters heretics and adversaries of development. The regime exposed an Islamist cell network in 1995 and subsequently initiated its most ruthless campaign to date. Militants who managed to escape to the Jebel Akhdar, also known as the Green Mountains, in eastern Libya, were quickly ensnared in a desperate struggle after being enslaved in the thousands. A significant number of these combatants possessed prior experience confronting adversaries with greater weaponry, having fought alongside the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the Soviet Union's invasion. In November 1996, while Gaddafi was visiting the town of Brak, a militant hurled a grenade at him, bringing the rebels dangerously close to executing him. As a retaliatory measure, Gaddafi initiated a scorched earth campaign that specifically targeted individuals who were in any way affiliated with the insurgents. Once more, unrestricted authority was granted to the revolutionary committees, and their heinous deeds were broadcast on national television. As a result of the army's increased control, the eastern region became a security zone. The regime executed 1,286 political detainees at the Abu Slim prison in 1996 and subsequently interred the bodies in mass graves. In an effort to consolidate his authority, Gaddafi implemented the Charter of Honor in 1997. This legislation inflicted collective penalties, including the deprivation of water and electricity, on families and tribes that provided sanctuary to militants. Penalties also included the economic isolation of the eastern half of the nation, which was a consequence of its support for Islamist insurgents. The eastern region, which was cut off from the rest of the country, started to resemble a post-conflict zone, with cities like Benghazi engulfed in abandoned and dilapidated infrastructure. Although the severe suppression had driven the opposition underground and maintained Gaddafi's regime, it was unable to eradicate the revolutionaries' memory. Moreover, the average daily inflation rate of an unprecedented 35% significantly complicated matters. Amid the widespread plight of Libyans, traders and well-connected elites continued to amass wealth, thereby establishing a novel and influential upper class. The social system appeared to be precariously situated, with corruption permeating all facets of the domain. It appeared that the protracted crisis of the 1990s was abating by 1998, when a number of countries lifted their expensive embargoes on Libya. In addition, anti-Western demonstrations ensued following the conviction of a Libyan for murder in the 1992 Pan Am flight incident by a Scottish court. As diplomatic disputes between American and Gaddafi persisted regarding his culpability for the bombardment, the dictator interpreted this as mere validation of American imperialism and grew enraged at American insistence that Libya provide compensation to the victims. Understanding the dangers of another period of isolation, a core group of advisors persuaded their commander to collaborate with the Americans. However, Gaddafi maintained his and Libya's innocence in the attack, which alarmed Western leaders who, via their intelligence networks, were aware that Gaddafi was assembling components and blueprints for a nuclear weapon. After the September 11 terrorist assaults in the United States and numerous other attacks across the Western world, these concerns were set aside. Gaddafi, seizing the opportunity to reclaim the upper hand, exclaimed with great exuberance that he had long forewarned humanity about the perils posed by Islamists such as Osama bin Laden. An odd turn occurred in the West's desperate search for Arab allies when Gaddafi condemned the September 11 attacks and extended his support to the United States. This was an abrupt change from the man who had devoted the majority of his life to conspiring against the United States. Nevertheless, similar to numerous other instances throughout his tenure, his animosity towards Libyan Islamists superseded his aversion to the United States. In an effort to earn the Western community's favor, Libya promptly commenced disclosing every piece of information it had gathered on Libyan Islamists. In fact, it went so far as to abandon its nuclear and chemical weapons programs in the process. The Americans, despite harboring profound suspicions, grossly underestimated Gaddafi's determination to maintain his regime. Without taking action to rectify the economic crisis, Gaddafi understood that his days were numbered. Libya had reached a consensus in December 2003 to cease its weapons of mass destruction program and grant access to inspectors within the country. While certain American leaders, including Secretary of State Colin Powell, boasted that Gaddafi had been intimidated by the American invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, a claim that Gaddafi vehemently refuted, controversies spread among Libyans regarding Gaddafi's impending return, which was met with approval in some circles. Although there was widespread opposition to the return of the Americans to Libya, many questioned whether the situation could be any more dire than Gaddafi's continued rule. Gaddafi, on the other hand, had adhered to the line and restored diplomatic relations between Libya and the United States and the United Kingdom. The United States restored diplomatic ties with Libya by June 2004. Sanctions were lifted in September 2004, and Libya was removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism by 2006. Relations rapidly underwent a transformation towards greater sympathy. In September 2009, Gaddafi paid his inaugural visit to the United States, where he was invited to partake in the United Nations General Assembly during the presidency of Barack Obama. Notwithstanding Gaddafi's evolving position towards the West, he steadfastly declined reform efforts and instead rekindled revolutionary fervor during the 2000s. He urged the Libyan youth to revitalize the revolution while assuring the populace that no changes would be made to the government. Nevertheless, in an effort to gain Western approbation, he conducted token improvements and permitted additional foreign investments. Certain members of Gaddafi's family, including his Vienna-educated free-market loyalist son Saif al-Islam, were at the vanguard of advocating for their father's reform of the deteriorating state. Nevertheless, Gaddafi and his allies consistently obstructed reform endeavors due to their reluctance to relinquish the established practices that had comprised the regime for more than 4 decades. Moreover, endeavors to reinstate privatization in the economy were ineffective in impeding the expansion of an oligarchic elite that capitalized on a renewed alliance with Western powers. This elite included a significant number of Gaddafi's offspring, who embraced an unprecedented and perilous degree of extravagance. While Western officials aspired to and trusted the sentiments of Libyans, including Saif Gaddafi, that change was imminent, discussions regarding democracy were superficial and never taken seriously. Almost everything was a fabrication. Gaddafi and the majority of his officials were resistant to change, regardless of the persuasion that his son or others might offer. The regime underwent a period of transition during which a portion of the Libyan population once more benefited militarily from reform, while the majority of the population never fully experienced its effects. Gaddafi was capricious and ruthless. His survival depended primarily on the state, and Libya appeared to be regressing into an anti-Western, socialist state. When a young lawyer from Benghazi named Fathi Turbal was arrested at 3:30 p.m. on February 15, 2011, while representing the families of those men killed in the Abu Slim prison massacre in 1996, latent tensions within Libyan society erupted violently. His offense was orchestrating a «day of rage» or large-scale demonstration scheduled for February 17, with the objective of advocating for constitutional reforms. Additionally, Gaddafi and his supporters were acutely cognizant of the impending unrest throughout the Middle East. Long-serving leaders of Tunisia and Egypt had been deposed, leading to the formation of new administrations. It was the inception of the Arab Spring, and Gaddafi may have perceived that action was necessary to prevent the collapse of his country as well. As public protests intensified, Gaddafi moved swiftly to snuff out the revolution's viper. He denounced the Tunisian Arab Spring uprisings, engaged in superficial yet purposeless public dialogues with ordinary Libyans, and offered insincere assurances of reform and increased aid. The regime accompanied these benevolent actions with its customary stringent repression, which consisted of detaining and interrogating prospective revolutionaries. However, in contrast to preceding decades when the Libyan government averted an impending revolution, it was already too late when Gaddafi came to power. As soon as word got around that the young attorney Turbal had been detained, direct demonstrations broke out in Benghazi, where throngs filled the streets. The international community observed with great disbelief as the masses transformed from protesters to rioters. As police stations were torched, the chants shifted their focus from reform to revolution. The populace desired the regime's downfall. On February 17, 2011, Gaddafi unleashed his revolutionary forces upon the populace, resulting in the deaths of dozens and the dispersion of the remainder. The following day, however, the throngs repopulated the streets and demanded change once more. In response to the escalating violence in Benghazi, uprisings emerged in various other cities. Gaddafi proceeded swiftly to isolate the city by interfering with cellular and internet connectivity. It ultimately failed. The revolution was rapidly disseminating throughout the world. As demonstrations expanded to urban areas across Libya, the governing regime's armed forces resorted to ruthless suppression of any opposition. As the death toll escalated and the masses continued to expand, Libyans weary of the daily terror and violence that had been the norm for so long joined the fray. Despite experiencing profound shock, Gaddafi promptly mobilized his forces in Tripoli, with the intention of initiating the process of re-establishing his governance. Amidst the tumultuous state of the country, a number of Gaddafi's former allies, including a school acquaintance, betrayed him by affiliating with the revolution. A revolt of such magnitude had never occurred during Gaddafi's entire reign as governor of Libya. He resolved to slaughter the dissidents in a manner that they would never forget. Gaddafi believed the moment had come to usher in the Second Jamahiriya by proclaiming new political reforms and a revolution inspired by his own that would be fueled by the rebels' deaths. Saif al-Islam, the reform-oriented son of Gaddafi, also betrayed the revolutionaries. After an initial successful assault in Tripoli, Gaddafi and his family quickly subdued the revolution in the western portion of Libya. The East was an entirely different affair. The Eastern revolutionaries formed a coalition of diverse organizations known as the National Transitional Council, NTC, with the objective of removing Gaddafi from power. A considerable number of NTC leaders were former Gaddafi officials and reformers who had renounced their positions after the rebellion had effectively endured the initial repression. Consisting primarily of technocrats who had previously advocated for reforms, the NTC's leadership laboriously attempted to consolidate the Libyan opposition into a stable and unified camp. The insurgents, nevertheless, were devoid of weaponry and military instruction. In March 2011, the rebel forces' initial advances were abruptly reversed, and it seemed that Gaddafi was making progress towards re-establishing power in Libya. On March 17, 2011, as his forces encircled the insurgent stronghold of Benghazi, Gaddafi issued the following proclamation: "Benghazi will be defeated tonight. I will pursue you flat by flat." A great number of onlookers feared that civilian blood would overwhelm the city. The West, nevertheless, thwarted Gaddafi's schemes once more. The United Nations Security Council authorized military action to protect civilians and voted for a no-fly zone over Libya on March 17. The impetus to intervene in Libya was propelled by the joint leadership of France and the United Kingdom. This initiative garnered backing from a segment of the Arab League that had historically been opposed to Western intervention. Under the direction of the United States, aircraft from France, Great Britain, and 9 other nations initiated assaults on Libyan forces. Seizing the opportunity, Gaddafi declared that Western powers were making preparations to invade Libya. Although force was displayed, Gaddafi exhibited no concern. He was resolved to fight until the battle was gory. Following a protracted and violent conflict in which the rebel forces nearly destroyed the entire infrastructure of the strategic city of Misrata with the assistance of NATO forces, Gaddafi progressively encircled his troops around the capital city of Tripoli and strengthened his grip on the area. People disappeared daily and regime forces marched through the city continuously. Despite the efforts of his son Saif to negotiate with the revolutionaries and the West, little interest was shown in such discussions. Gaddafi was seen as too unpredictable to be trusted. After the civilians residing in the vicinity of Benghazi were subjected to months of devastation, assurances of free elections and democratic principles appeared meaningless. The NTC appeared to be an exemplary government, eager to assist the populace and re-establish operations in Libya. Gaddafi frequently retaliated against the NTC, labeling them colonial powers collaborators. The revolutionaries and their NATO allies had nearly encircled Tripoli and initiated a march into the city by August 2011. As the Gaddafi forces disintegrated, pro-revolutionary masses flooded the streets and stormed his residence. Gaddafi and his family, however, remained untraceable. Following the encirclement of Tripoli by rebel forces, Gaddafi and a handful of devoted supporters escaped to his birthplace of Sirte. The remaining Gaddafi dynasty members sought refuge in sanctuaries both within and beyond Libya in an attempt to evade the repercussions of their father's regime. In the interim, rebel forces totally exacted vengeance on Gaddafi's allies by obliterating Bani Walid and Sirte. Numerous violations of human rights occurred, and the revolutionaries' irate failure to locate Gaddafi in Bani Walid motivated their reckless destruction of the city. The battle for Sirte continued well into October, with regime forces frantically attempting to hold on despite the fact that capitulation would be fatal. Gaddafi persisted in Sirte, subsisting on rice and linguine that he had personally scavenged from the city's ruins. Using his satellite phone, he consulted the Quran and requested assistance. The convoy was taken aback when a NATO flypast initiated a severe assault as the individual attempted to flee Sirte. Gaddafi was carried into a sewer to conceal his wounds to both legs. As soon as rebel forces arrived, they dragged Gaddafi outside while he begged for mercy while showering blows on the 60-something-year-old man. A youthful rebel adolescent ultimately shot and killed Gaddafi, the once proud leader of Libya. His corpse was transported from Sirte via the streets of Misrata, where it was exhibited as a war trophy after having been carried through those streets. Despite entreaties from the NTC and the insurgents regarding the burial of the body, the populace declined to acquiesce. Gaddafi was to receive not a shred of honor or regard. The violent individual who reshaped Libya to suit his purposes and came to dominate the country inspired ire and malice among his subjects. Even days and weeks after his death, audiences gathered for the next 4 days to take photographs of Gaddafi and one of his sons in their rotting remains. Gaddafi's burial took place on October 25, 2011, in an unidentified area of the Libyan desert. A teenager murdered in a gutter the man who aspired to become the next father of the Arabs and leader of the developing world. Despite having terrorized the Libyan people for 4 decades, his reign came to an end at the behest of the people, whom he had consistently claimed to represent. In your opinion, what is Muammar Gaddafi? Did he care little for the health and safety of his subjects, or was he a genuine autocrat compelled by Western pressures to resort to violence? Please provide your feedback in the remarks section, and thank you for viewing in the interim.